Now, I have known my next guest for fully almost 50 years, actually. Although neither of us looks like that could possibly be true. It is. I first met him in the early 1970s, so it's almost literally 50 years ago. Since when, our paths diverged on one or two things, but on one thing, not. We both are absolutely determined that Scotland should remain in Britain because we believe that that's what's best for the people of this small island of English-speaking people, but in particular, what's best for the working class people in this small island. On that, we will always be in step. But if you have a different point of view, of course, we want to hear it. But we also want to hear from the Right Honourable Brian Wilson, CBE, former Labour Minister, former Ayrshire Member of Parliament. Brian, thank you very much for joining us. It's been some time since we spoke. How are you feeling about the political situation in Scotland today or this week when we have what will likely be the collapse of the Salmond inquiry, which will be a collapse following on a whole number of other collapses of SNP-run enterprises, whether Bifab or the ferry company or the sick children's hospital in Edinburgh that never opened. So many calamities, one after the other. How can these people possibly still be in the lead in the opinion polls? Your view?
Well, I divide it in two, George. First, on specifically on the state of the Holyrood Committee inquiry. I feel really depressed and concerned that many of the problems I foresaw about the Scottish Parliament are coming home to roost. I think it's a terrible reflection on the Parliament, not just on the committee, not just on the Scottish Government, but that this can be allowed to happen. And, you know, I'm no lover of either Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon, but I am a lover of principles of justice. And I, as far as I'm concerned, if a man is not found guilty in court, then he must be treated as innocent. And he's as entitled to give his account of events as anyone else. In fact, he's more entitled because it's really him who has been put through the mill, and then the court has found him not guilty of these offences. And so as a byproduct of these events, that this committee was set up, that Sturgeon, as usual, always looking for the headline, that there would be complete transparency, everything would be made available. And like so much else, it simply was not true. And everything the Scottish Government and Sturgeon and co have done since then has been to obstruct and to obfuscate to the point at which, quite possibly, the committee will simply break down, and that will be greatly to her convenience. And you know, I find it so depressing that this is what Scottish politics are reduced to now. That there is no accountability. That there are the elements of a one-party state. There is the arrogance of a one-party regime, and as long as they can bulldoze this kind of thing through, then the mechanisms to hold them to account appear simply not to exist. So at that level, I'm simply depressed by the feebleness and the inadequacy of the response to these events, and particularly to the potential gross breach of due process, which it now entails. On the wider political scene, how do they maintain this? Well, they maintain this by, like all nationalist parties, by being a sort of a coalition of people for whom there is really only one political interest, and that is achieving a separation from the rest of the UK, and everything else is subordinate to that, and everything else can be blamed on someone else, and everything can be attributed to lack of powers, even when ostensibly the powers that exist are not being used to anything like their full extent or their full competence. So it's a difficult one wherever you get nationalism prevailing by, where you get the politics of flags, where you get people pulled together on a sort of false patriotism, then everything else becomes subordinate. And Scotland's been moving towards that, and now has quite an important decision to take if that really is the road we want to go down.
Now, both of us are supporters of Glasgow Celtic, but one of the crimes, I would say, of the current Scottish government, because the Lord Advocate is actually a member of the current Scottish government, was the incredible story of the malicious prosecution. That's the police and Crown Office's words, not mine. The malicious prosecution of the Rangers administrators, which so far has cost the taxpayer in Scotland almost £25 million and may well cost another £25 million more. How does a government, how does a Lord Advocate survive that kind of scandal?
Well, it is very odd. It doesn't matter whether it's Celtic or Rangers or Timbuktu. The point is that, as you say, it's not in journalistic headlines. It is in the words of the Scottish legal system itself that this was brought about by malicious prosecution. It is extraordinary. Malicious anything you usually go to jail for, but malicious prosecution in Scotland has been perpetrated by the very people who are supposed to prevent that sort of thing or to prosecute that sort of thing. So, excuse me, it's part of a pattern, George. It's part of a pattern of which there is no scandal big enough really to break through because of the constant barrage of the Constitution. And it's a self-reinforcing thing. Because if you ever hear any, London media who think they have to tick the box of covering Scotland, then they don't do the story of the Lord Advocate. They don't do the story of BIFAB. They don't do the story of being slow in vaccinations. The story they do is the Constitution. So the thing goes on and on and on. But the only thing that is happening in Scotland is about the Constitution. And if you look at headlines and polls, then you see a majority or a small majority for independence just now, which is really irrelevant given all else that is going on. But even in these polls, what you see is that people's priorities are about recovering from the pandemic. They're about jobs. They're about the National Health Service. They're about their deep worries about the education system. These are the priorities of the people. But the media obsession is with the Constitution. And that is very, very hard to change because the Constitution is an easy story. And of course, it's the one that's being driven all the time by the nationalists, not least in order to cover up the kind of scandal that you described very accurately.
Well, in the pro-war Observer this very day, there is the laziest possible tour of the Scottish horizon by a London-based journalist, which reinforces every trope that the SNP government would like reinforced, and undermine, and doesn't even mention the scandal of malicious prosecution. As you say, a malicious anything normally puts you into jail, but a malicious prosecution in which you're trying to put someone else in jail is double the number. But you were before Parliament and since a celebrated journalist, an genuine independent journalistic powerhouse. When you look around the Scottish media landscape, you must shrink in horror at it, particularly, I may say, the broadcast media, which the SNP TV would be what the independent channel would be better called, but BBC Scotland, which has clearly forgotten what the first B in the acronym BBC stands for. What do you say?
Well, I think particularly on the salmon stuff, I think that the two Scottish mainstream broadcasters, that their behaviour has been disgraceful. But essentially, they want this to be a story that doesn't exist. Their interest in it, when the tumbrils failed to roll at the High Court, their interest ended there. But you have this incredible inquiry going on, this evidence coming out bit by bit, in spite of all the efforts of the Scottish government to prevent it. And yet it is almost completely ignored by both BBC Scotland and STV, and certainly not presented in any cohesive and coherent way. And it is actually, that thank goodness for the written press, because anything that has come out about this has come through newspapers, because they can't control all of them and they can't control all the people who write for them. Also, I might say, from broadcasters from outside Scotland. You occasionally get something from Channel 4 News, and you get quite a lot actually from Sky News on this stuff. But actually, waiting for any original revelation from BBC Scotland or from STV, you'll be waiting a very long time. And it is shameful. And I think that it's a reflection of a lot else in Scottish society. When you have effectively one party running everything, their level of control they can exercise, both direct and indirect, is really quite sinister.
Now, way back in the days when we first knew each other and worked together, you were against Scottish devolution and I was for it. You're too polite to say, but might you be thinking that you were right and I was wrong?
Well, I wouldn't say it in these bald terms. Sometimes it's inevitably it's a much more subtle argument. I mean, as you know my background, George, you know where I'm talking to you from now. I'm talking to you from the most westerly point virtually in the United Kingdom. I'm talking to you from the very periphery. So the idea I'm against devolution is wrong. What I was always concerned about was that devolution politically would not lead to the devolution of power down to communities, whether it's the impoverished parts of the city of Glasgow or whether it's places like this in the periphery. And what devolution would end up meaning would be the accumulation of power in Edinburgh. And that is exactly what has happened. So I was right about that. My two fears about devolution, one was that it would be a platform for nationalism rather than stopping in its tracks, as some people said. And the other was that it would take power away from communities and from local authorities and so on into this concentration of power in Edinburgh. And in both of these, I think I was right. However, the 80s changed everything, and I don't shrink from this. That Donald Dewar once said, when he was called, he was described as the godfather or something of devolution, and he replied, "Look, devolution has only one godparent, and that is Margaret Thatcher, because the extremism of Thatcherism and the damage it wrought, and through the sheer stupidity of things like the poll tax and so on, that it created a mood in Scotland that said never again, that we need a degree of protection from that." So by the time you get into the 1990s, while I didn't have any change of view of the potential dangers of devolution, I didn't oppose it. I said, that's it. There isn't an argument that is going to stop this, but be aware of the potential damage it can do, of the potential pitfalls that exist, and safeguard against them. And that is where I would be critical, is that I don't think that there was a sufficient understanding that devolution would probably end up with the nationalists running the place. Doesn't necessarily mean that it would lead to separation, but it would probably lead to the nationalists running the place. And you'd better be very smart on your feet in order to stop that happening, because once they have the levers of power, and once they have the money that goes with the levers of power, then they will use every one of them very effectively to drive division within this small island, which is exactly what they have done.
I accept absolutely that Thatcherism is the principal godparent of the unstoppable demand that there came to be by the time of the referendum in 1999 for a Scottish Parliament. I can't remember the numbers now, but it was absolutely overwhelming numbers in favour of that. But equally, your own party and formerly mine, the Labour Party, was, when we first sat together on the Scottish Executive Committee, a man called Willie Ross might well have been the King of Scotland. He acted like it, and in a sense, he really was the sovereign of all he surveyed. We held almost all the parliamentary seats, controlled almost all the councils, such quangos as there were. The unions were strong. They were all led by people that supported Labour, and all of that is gone now. In fact, I now see people who were with us have now become Scottish nationalists. Where did it all go wrong?
Well, I think a lot of it went wrong, for the reasons I just explained through devolution. That Labour was still in a pretty strong position up to 2010. But by that time, the SNP did have they had the levers of power, and they had the money that goes with it, and they've used it very effectively. There is no really, Scotland is a small place, and if you use your power with the third sector, with the media, with the quangos, with all of these things very ruthlessly and very effectively for one end, then it over a period it makes a very big difference, and they have all that power. And Labour never found an answer to it. They never managed to, partly through weak leadership, it has to be said, which squeezed them out of the natural territory that Labour should occupy. But it's never found a way, of combining this. They allowed the language of politics in Scotland to change. If you don't want to break up Britain, if you don't want to break up the working class in Britain, if you don't want to break up all the institutions that have given you and I our life chances, if you don't want to do all of these things, then you're a unionist. Now, I didn't come into politics to be a unionist, which, as you again know, has got very particular connotations in Scottish politics. I came into politics to try to advance the social and economic interests of working people and their families throughout the state in which I live, which happens to be the British state, which has given us all the pluses that we've had in our lifetimes. So to change the line where the dichotomy, the division in politics between separatism and unionism is a completely uncomfortable language for anyone who comes from a sort of socialist background, who's simply wanting to, in politics, to create change, and is not interested in creating change only within Scotland, but is in Britain as a whole. And you then put power into the hands of people whose vested interest is in not using the powers of devolution in order to achieve what is best for Scotland, but is to make damn sure that devolution doesn't work in order to sell the narrative that the only way you can succeed is to go beyond that and to create a separate state. So in all of that, it's created largely from our own making, largely, you might say, from the good intentions behind devolution, but Labour has made this bed of nails for itself to lie on and hasn't yet found a very comfortable position. But I still think that when you come to I don't think there will be a referendum for a long time to come, which means we don't have to immediately be in a state of panic about that. But if you ask for me, what is the majority or the biggest single political position in Scotland today, I would say it is the position that Labour occupies, which is people who do not particularly want to create a separate state and who do want to see a left of centre position on social and economic interests. So you have this potential vote still there, but somehow in order to manifest itself, you have to break through the politics of nationalism, which at the moment dominate everything.
Well, of course, it's going to be a long time before there is a referendum, but it's not going to be a long time before the Scottish Parliament elections. Would you agree with me that if the SNP secure a majority in May, we'll very quickly, therefore, be on the road to Catalonia, which in the end was a bit of pushing and shoving. Not many died. But given the special peculiarities about Scotland and geographical proximities, are you anxious, as I am, that it will not so much be Catalonia as Northern Ireland?
Well, that's territory that I would hate to be the guy that predicted that. There are elements in the mix that are combustible, but I certainly wouldn't predict that, and I would hope that sanity would prevail, long before you get anywhere near that. But on Catalonia, I think they'll be off their heads if they go for an illegal referendum that hasn't been ratified by the UK Parliament. And I don't think at the end of the day they'll do that, because exactly the same would happen to them as to happen to the Catalan separatists. It would set back their cause rather than bring it forward, because nobody else would go near the referendum with a barge pole. So they're stuck in this, quite rightly they're stuck in this, because again, I think it's wildly irresponsible just to even talk about having a referendum in the next few years, while every sinew should be focused on recovering from the pandemic. In the longer term, I'm a Democrat as above everything, and if there is a clear and persistent will for people in Scotland to have a separate state, then that should be put to the test. I have no doubt about that. But the idea is that you keep turning up demanding another referendum on the time-honoured principle of nationalism. You only have to win once. The other lot have to win all the time, but you only have to win once. And you choose the day, you choose the question. And if you win, then that's it for the rest of time. But if you lose, you just come back the next day and have another one. That is not acceptable. And there is no case for a referendum in the next few years, in the lifetime of the Scottish Parliament. And then let's see, because every politician, George, as we both know very well, is mortal. In a few years' time, there won't be Boris Johnson, there probably won't be Nicola Sturgeon. There will be a very different set of economic circumstances, a very different set of arguments. So let's see in the fullness of time, but for them to say, we are going to have a referendum the day we want, in the certain knowledge that if they lost that referendum, if they lost Indy Ref 2, then the next morning they'd be on to Indy Ref 3. That is something which I don't think the majority of people, or anything like the majority of people in Scotland, want.
Brian Wilson, thanks for joining us on the Mother of All talk shows. Much appreciated.